What is the natural law? To understand this, we first have to have an understanding of what is law in general. The definition of law is a certain promulgated ordinance of reason for the common good by one who has care of the community. So there are 4 elements for a law to be a law. If one of these elements is missing, we do not have to abide by the apparent law. The first, it has to be reasonable, that all can follow it, or those who are instructed to follow are able to follow it, and it must be for the common good. If it's not reasonable, it's not for the common good, we are not obligated to follow it. It also has to be instituted or promulgated by he who has authority over the community. So if I were to declare a law for the city of Cleveland, it would not matter because I don't have authority over them. And even the government who wants to create laws, the law cannot be, doesn't have any power until the people in authority actually promulgate and declare that this is a law and people understand it. Okay, a law is an ordinance of reason which indicates it is a command of reason which structures, directs, or orders future action. So we can say, in a sense, it's about ordering the common good of a society and even of individual people within a society. It is important to understand, therefore, that a law must be something which proceeds from reason, and it is intended to supply order to a community by commanding certain things be done and prohibiting other things. All right, there are 2 types of law. Divine law, those are the laws from God, and positive law, those are laws from man. Now, divine law can be under various aspects. Divine law can be just the very ways that natures occur, the very ways that rocks fall to the earth. We call these the laws of nature. But there's also the natural law, the law by which human nature is directed, where rocks and plants and animals always abide by their nature. Man has a free will, and if man wants, man can act against his nature. And it's important that man takes the time to understand the law, the natural law God has given him, so that he can abide by the laws of God. All right. The natural law is part of the divine law, but on the divine, it's a divine law that's written in the hearts of men. So the natural law can also be defined as the light of God given to man, since the natural light of reason is that by which man is able to discern the good and the bad. We can know this through reason. Let's give an example. We have a dog, can be trained to do things. He can be trained to act a certain way. But if a dog does something against your training, it's not going to be dwelling and pondering that it did something wrong, that it broke some sort of rule. It's merely acting based on the way it's been trained to act. Whereas man can act based on the way he's been trained to act, right? If you have men that are working for some master in a field somewhere, they can be trained to act a certain way based on the master that has rules and whatever for them. But there's also man without being trained like a dog or cat to act a certain way. Man can be instructed and told to act a certain way and told about rules. And this is what makes man separate from the animals. Man can really look at his structure. He can look at how God made him. And by observing how God made him, he can observe the rules and know how to act in accord with the natural law or the laws God has imposed upon him. Now, some of these are very basic. The most basic elements of the natural law are known by all. The most fundamental aspect, do good and avoid evil. All men, when they're children, unless they have severe, mental handicaps. No, they should embrace the good and avoid the evil. In the basic manner, they want to avoid pain, avoid harm, and they want to nourish their bodies and flourish to the best of their abilities. But we, as I said before, we just naturally know to do this. Man naturally seeks to survive, and he naturally seeks to multiply his species. Look at man in society. As man grows to be a social animal and lives among other men, he also seeks justice. And he also seeks justice for his friends. If someone is stolen from, man desires that not just himself, but that he live in a community where justice prevails among all. All right. To understand the natural law, we understand the idea of self-evident principles. And that's what we said before. There are things that are just obvious to us. For example, let's take the statement, man is a rational animal. Okay, by understanding what rational is intelligence, and by understanding what man is, the moment I see a man, I immediately just know, oh, he is a rational thing, because by understanding man, understanding rational, and observing man, I can combine the two. I don't need to think how to do this. We just do this naturally. If someone were unable to do this as an adult, we would have very big concerns with what's wrong with them. And it wouldn't be something that we could teach them. It's some sort of inherent ability they would be lacking. And that is what we mean by it is self-evident. Now, those are the basic precepts of the natural law. The more advanced precepts of the natural law are not self-evident. If I asked you, what can we know about morality through reason alone? Most people have a hard time determining this. And we're going to go through that real quick. But the more advanced precepts, we're going to find many of them are very basic. But the more advanced precepts, like just war, and we can use strike people and also hit civilians in a war, these are very complicated, and even modern philosophers and theologians have some debate about exactly how just war and attacking enemies and also wounding civilians, exactly how that works. So to understand the natural law well and all its precepts, you need to have a significant amount of wisdom and knowledge. Okay, so what exactly is natural law? So I'm going to go through and explain this real quick. Let's pretend we're on an island, and through reason alone, we've determined there's one all-powerful God. And we need to now know what are some laws God has bestowed upon us. So we can look around the island, we can see maybe some other people there, and we can think, well, God created me. And God wants me to exist. That's the reason I exist. That's the reason anything exists. Let's say I were to take myself out of existence. Would that be a sin? We know God wants me to exist. But if I take myself out of existence because I want to kill myself, that would be a sin, because clearly it's contrary to God's will. God wants me to remain in existence, and he gave me a natural desire to preserve my existence. Well, if that's the case too, I can look around me to preserve my existence. I can't just sit and do nothing. I have to go gather food and shelter. So the obligation to preserve ourselves, to go eat food and nourish ourselves and start to build a small civilization, is necessary by the natural law. We can look at some of their faculties and see the way they're ordered, and we can see obvious purposes in them. Let's look at the digestive system. Clearly, the purpose of the digestive system is to eat and to nourish the body. We could put this another way and say that God created the digestive system to nourish ourselves. Now, what does the word pervert mean? The word pervert literally means to use something against its purpose. How could we pervert the digestive system? If you were to eat so much food that would be pleasurable but harm you, well, you would then be perverting the digestive system. And that's where the sin of gluttony comes in. We have this natural inclination for food, which is a good thing. It's by the natural law. But our natural inclinations have to be subordinated to reason. So even though our hunger is good at going toward food, right? Reason has to control that desire and say, okay, yes, we need to have food, but we need to only have so much food that is healthy and beneficial for us. Now, we can also do the same with the intellect. We can look and see that man is separate from all the animals. How is he different? He can grasp, he can think. What's the purpose of the intellect is to know truth, to understand the world around him. And ultimately we can say it's to love and serve God. But if the purpose of the intellect is to know truth and to understand the outside world, we combine, what is the purpose of speech? Unlike all the other animals, man can talk, man can converse. What's the purpose of speech? The purpose of speech is ultimately to spread truth. Now, what if I'm going to use my intellect and my speech to deceive someone else? Well, that would be a sin. It's against the very nature of the reason God has given me these faculties. So through reason alone, we can see that lying is disordered, lying is displeasing to God, and lying is a sin because it's contrary to the laws of nature. Next, we can look at the reproductive system. Obviously, the end and purpose of the reproductive system is to have children. So if we're going to use the reproductive system in a way to pervert it or to prevent children from coming forth, then we're going to do damage to or harm to the natural law, right? We're not going to be abiding by it. We are using these faculties contrary to the very purpose. Now, man is different than the animals. Man, like the animals, is to have children, but man is made for even more than that. Man is intellectual. Why did God give man this intellectual faculty? What's its purpose? All of the faculties have a purpose that they're flourishing toward. Ultimately, the intellect is oriented toward truth, knowing the causes of things, right? Why are things the way they are? Like children who always ask why. But what's the greatest cause that we have? The greatest cause is God. And ultimately, the intellect wants to know and understand God in a perfect manner, but still attempts to understand God to the best of its abilities. Once the intellect understands God and thinks about him more, he realizes he was created by him. If he was created by God, then he owes God something. So being created by God, he needs to offer prayers and sacrifices back to God. He can offer him physical things and sacrifices, but most importantly is his heart. Offer a love to God. Pray to him. Say thank you for what he's done. When man is in need, he can go to God as act of humility and ask God for help, ask God for assistance, showing God. When man asks God for assistance, he's showing God that I am so weak and insignificant. I need you to help me. Without you, I will perish. So through the natural law, all these things are important. Now, if man sees that having this intellect, he has this important duty to praise God, then that means that when man is to raise children, his purpose in raising children is not just to make children, but it's to make children and help them achieve their purpose. And their purpose is to love and serve God. So the purpose of the reproductive system for man is more than the animals. It's not just to have children. It's to have children that are holy and prepare them for heaven. If you're not preparing your children for heaven, you're not fulfilling your duty as a parent. Okay, so we have, based off of this, we have a basic understanding of what the natural law is. But let's go a little more into some of the details of what exactly the natural law is in a more technical manner. So we have what are called the first principle of practical reason. So there's speculative reason, which is where we contemplate universal ideas like God, justice, goodness. But then there's the practical reason, and that is that we desire the good. Practical reason is things that we determine how to obtain the good things in our lives. And that is a large area where natural law comes to place. A desire is placed in a being for the sake of its fulfillment and perfection. For one does not desire that which is not a perfection, or which is to one's detriment. So after one contemplates an all-powerful God, there is reward for those who do good and punishment for those who do evil. The practical reason must determine, okay, how am I going to be good? And how am I going to be evil? Or to avoid evil? And to do this, it requires contemplation and understanding the laws of God. Okay, so there are two parts. There are the lower and there are the higher appetites. And the lower appetites are good. Those are things we sense. Those are things we crave by our body. The higher appetites are reason and will. And some things that's going to be vital in the natural law is not just giving in to what our lower appetites desire, but it's being moved toward the proper things by our lower appetites, but guiding that direction through our intellect and higher appetite. Now this can be confusing, and to understand this, we need to understand what is meant by nature. So the word nature is something that can have multiple different meanings. The word nature can refer to trees and animals, and you're walking through the woods and you're experiencing nature. Okay, that is the definition of nature. But then there's the philosophical definition of nature, when we talk about philosophy of nature, and that is the essence of things. So everything has essence. You know, Bob, Jim, Sarah, they might be different people, they might have different bodies, but they're all the same type of thing, and they have the same essence or same nature. The reason Jesus redeemed us all is because human nature was nailed to the cross, and therefore human nature was redeemed. If one of us does not possess the nature, the human nature of Christ, then one of us would not be redeemed. So when we talk about the natural law, we need to get a glance at the essence of man. What is in him that makes him man? What are his attributes? How did God design him? How did God order him? Okay? Once we understand the purpose of his faculties, then we can understand how to live by the natural law. Now, there are some that say, well, living by nature is living by how you feel. Or in other words, is living by your disposition, right? You were born a certain way, you were born with certain dispositions, that's what's natural. And that's not necessarily true. Someone could be born with only one leg, but it's not natural to be born with one leg. That would be a defect and something that would prevent you from fully fulfilling your nature. Man by his nature is made to walk. If you're born with one leg, you wouldn't be able to do that. You're still a human. You still can do many human things, but lacking that one leg would be a defect. Again, a lot of people take disposition to mean nature. For example, some people have a disposition where they're more likely to fall into alcoholism and drinking problems. And their argument would be, oh, well, you know, I'm just naturally seem to drink, so I shouldn't fight this. I should just embrace it because that's my natural disposition. I'm acting according to my nature. No, you are acting according to your disordered disposition. You have a human nature that particular vice, that disposition, is harming and hurting. We could give other examples. Maybe some people have some deviant, or they have a tendency to cheat on their wives or whatnot. And so this is my disposition. I desire these things. I should just give in to these dispositions. And whatever sexual deviancies you have, just because maybe you were born with desiring those various inordinate desires, does not mean make them good in and of themselves. Upon looking at the body, we can see that large amounts of alcohol are damaging and harmful to the human organism. And we can see that people who cheat on their wives and live with many mistresses have a profound psychological damage on themselves and on their families. We can even give more basic things. Let's say someone who's addicted to gambling, right? There's no physical problem with addiction to gambling like alcohol does. But the addiction to gambling harms you terribly in a social way. If you have an addiction to gambling and you have a family, there are times where these people gamble away all their money and they can barely feed their own children. They can barely buy clothes for them. It may be your disposition that you naturally are more inclined and more easily addicted to gambling. But if we're going to live a truly human life, it is to find our defects and conquer them, not to embrace the defects that we have. Now, how do we find out what's a defect and how we ought to be? Well, we need to understand nature apart from ourselves. We can look at how we act and how we are, and we say how I am is just my nature. Well, that's not completely true. We need to look at man and see how man ought to be. We need to look at the more virtuous and upright people and use them as a model to base ourselves and conform ourselves toward. That way we can more properly follow the natural law, right? Only by following this ordinance of nature, a true human nature, will be living good and healthy lives. All right, we need to understand the difference between norm and average. So the average is just how most people are. Normal is not the same thing. A normal person is one who is actually acting according to his nature. So let's say we're in a society where everyone has one leg. Something happened in the gene pool and people are born with one leg, right? You have maybe 1,000 people. Maybe at some point the majority of people on Earth had one leg. It's still contrary to human nature to be that way. Man was made to have 2 legs. They may be the average, but that isn't what a normal human being is like. Same thing is true with alcoholism. Everyone could be addicted to alcohol, but if you're addicted to alcohol, that's not normal. That's not how man is meant to be. That's not man according to his nature. And same is true with any of the vices. We are called to cultivate virtues so that we are not engaging in vices and disordered actions. And the natural law actually requires us to cultivate virtue. We don't have a lot of time in this talk to get into those details, but basic virtues like justice, temperance, prudence, these aren't just necessary to live a holy life. They're really necessary to find happiness and order in the life of anyone. You could really argue that living a life according to the natural law in Christianity would be beneficial and serve in one's attainment of happiness, even if one were an atheist, because of the order and balance it places in one's life. So back to normal and average, a big problem we have nowadays is that a lot of modern psychologists have based how man ought to live on average and not off of what is normal. And this has been extremely damaging because they've encouraged people. Maybe you have a desire, a disposition to drink or to cheat on your spouse, right? Cheating your spouse is a classic one because there's no, in a sense, no physical damage, but like alcohol does. But even if there was, but regardless of that, people have been encouraged in some psychological sessions to give into their maybe sexual deviancies, cheating on their spouse, whatever, because it makes them feel good because they like it. And because there's no physical harm from it, they say, well, it's okay. But that's really irrelevant because it's contrary to your nature and it's going to have a really damaging psychological effect on you, even if there's not a physical harm on yourself. And this is part of the reason why a lot of modern psychology has had problems. And once we go over conscience, we'll find that some of this modern psychology has actually been a cause of people who maybe they're living this degenerate lifestyle. Deep down, they know it's wrong. Their consciousness is telling them it's wrong, and it's eating them away. And the only thing that will really bring them happiness is to get rid of this and attain the virtues, to escape it. But some modern psychologists have told people to embrace it because that's where you're finding your happiness, or at least your short happiness from a little bit of pleasure you've been attaining. All right. The precepts of the natural law follow the order of natural inclinations, and the first is the preservation of their being and nature. Okay, very obvious, that's the first one, so we don't want to commit suicide, and we want to keep ourselves in existence, right? When we think the most basic thing man can know is that he strives to preserve his existence. And it's not only to continue to exist, but to exist as a man. Man wants to exist according to his nature, the way he is. Men want to exist as men, and women naturally are happy and take a joy in being women. Okay, most also respect the existence of other people. If I know I'm a man and I want to exist in my humanity, and that's good for me to exist that way, I look around and see other people, and I also want them to exist in that sort of way. And that's why murder is really contrary to this first precept of the natural law. The second inclination of man pertains to all of those things which have in common with animals, such as reproduction, eating, the upbringing of offspring. And you could argue eating is included in the first precept, but is also part of the second precept. So we're supposed to do all those things to survive, provide shelter, everything. Okay, and the third category is something specific to man alone who has reason. The natural law also inclines man to live in society and to get along with others. It inclines man toward pursuing the truth and pursue the truth about God. So this is the rational part. It's a man who, unlike the animals, has an intellect and a will. He ponders truth. He ponders the causes of things. And if you think about the causes of things, he must arrive at the ultimate cause of all things, which is God, to whom he owes religion and much worship and praise, this all-powerful God. Now, I can also see that in his ability to survive, for man to live on his own is not very easy. Nowadays, there's TV shows on men surviving by themselves in the woods because it's so extremely difficult and not easy. So in order to survive more easily, man naturally is inclined to live in community and to live in a society and to get along with others. But to get along with others requires that man form some sort of governance and form a society with rules and regulations to keep peace and to ensure justice among peoples. All right, so those are the three levels. And really all of morality comes from these precepts of natural law. Now we can think of some kind of more complicated examples. Let's take stealing, for example. So why is stealing a sin? Well, for example, in society, man maybe has his farm and he wants to produce things, and he produces these tools so that he can work on his farm. He takes the time to harvest the grain. Now he has a store of food so he can feed himself. Then he sees, Bob, and Bob's taking his time to make furniture so he can sit and relax and have a bed to sleep in. And, the two of them want to trade with each other. It becomes obvious that the two have taken time to make these things for their survival, would trade, and they would acknowledge that the fact that one made something means that they possess that and own those things and have a right to those things. So just based off of man's obligation to live in society, we can see how stealing and theft would very obviously be seen and observed as sins. It almost seemed natural. I don't think you'd really have to do much contemplation to realize that these things that these other person made and take time to grow and cultivate, that they would have a special possession over in a way that you would not. So free property is part of the natural law. And that's part of the reason communism is so disordered. It's one reason, because communism seeks to get rid of the right to own property, and communism for that and other reasons is contrary to the natural law. All right, so all these three categories are done in a way which requires reason. And so the category which is proper to man indicates that reason is the proper norm for man. What is in accord with the reason determines what should and should not be done according to the natural law. Okay, so though there are three levels, right? And for the first and the second, there are natural inclinations that encourage us to preserve our life and to go and reproduce and eat like the animals. There must be something behind us, a reason behind all those acts that directs them more perfectly than the animal would direct them. The dog will eat terrible things that aren't healthy for it, or might eat its own vomit or something disgusting. But man who has an intellect doesn't just act based off of his instincts. He can reason this is not good and not helpful, helpful for his body or nutritious, and therefore not commit these acts. Okay, so therefore there are essentially three categories of natural inclination. One, that which is toward the conservation of his being. The second category of natural inclination, that which is common with all animals. Those first two, as I said before, those are bodily and caused by more like the emotions. And the third is intellectual, that which is proper to man alone who possesses reason. And that is to watch over the lower parts, but also to worship God and to live in a society. All right, so for all morality comes from these precepts, but more advanced precepts are difficult to know through reason alone. Polygamy and divorce are two classic examples of this. So polygamy is obviously in the animals who don't even get married, but some animals do mate for life. But if you look from scripture and just if you really think about it, in a polygamous marriage, there's never going to be happiness and there's never going to be peace. If you're the man, you're going to have multiple women that are not going to be happy with each other. They're going to want the full attention of their husband because that's how married couples are designed to be. The women are always going to feel a lack of fulfillment. They're never going to be happy because they can't attain this. And then they're going to their husband and they're not going to let their husband feel at peace because they're always going to have a tension amongst each other. So clearly, polygamy doesn't lead to happiness. It's contrary to the natural law. Divorce, also contrary to the natural law. People who get divorced can tell you divorce is extremely painful and you never truly get over divorce. There's always kind of something deep down that's eating you away. So when you look at divorce, what it is, it may have been allowed by Moses, but it wasn't what God desired. It's forbidden in the New Testament. And just by observing divorce and the great mental anxiety it causes in people, It's not a good thing. Okay, so virtue is something good according to reason. A man who is a slave to his vices cannot act well. I used to teach at a different school, and I used to say to the kids, I swear, if we throw one of these phones off a cliff, they're going to go jump right after them. And there are cases now where kids are so addicted to their phones that they just can't get off of them, and their employers tell them to stop, and they keep texting all the time, and they actually fire the kids. And the reason is because these people don't have the virtue to mortify themselves, the virtue to say, okay, I'm only going to use my phone at the proper time. But the rest of the time, they're just so addicted to it, they can't put it down. So virtue is really important. Now, the goodness of things such as poverty and celibacy cannot really be known to the natural law. According to the natural law, you should acquire a certain amount of wealth to support your family, support yourself. And also, it's good to have children and have a family. By our nature, we are designed to be fertile, multiply, and reproduce the species. Poverty and celibacy are good things, but their goodness really can't be known through the natural law. We would have to have revelation from God to know that these are good things. Conscience is the act of the intellect by which judgment is applied to the object of election. Okay, so now we're going to go over conscience. And conscience is really the vehicle by which man carries out the natural law. So it's in the intellect, and it determines whether an act is right, wrong, good, or bad. And right, wrong, good, or bad is partly too when you're about to do something, you can say, well, it's right or wrong, it's good or bad. You can contemplate it, or you can feel guilty about choosing one act. You can feel guilty during the act while you're committing it, and then after you've committed the act, and you know you did something bad, your conscience goes over back something and thinks about it. Okay, so conscience is part of the intellect. We judge the thing we did as contrary to the truth. We know we live a certain way. We know these laws are to follow. We know this is reasonable. We know this is how we ought to act. But our conscience comes in when we feel guilt when we did not complete the act. When conscience makes a judgment, it applies the knowledge it has of what is right and wrong, and what is suitable or unsuitable. So in order to have a conscience work, you have to have knowledge of what is good and bad. And this is why moral formation is extremely important in children. If children do not have a good conscience, then they cannot, or not a good moral formation, then their conscience cannot guide them to act well. As I said, though basic precepts of the natural law are easily known, the more advanced ones are not so easily known, especially to children. And this is why it's not just children that need to have a well-formed conscience, but it is all of society. It is adults. It is helpful when the culture naturally imposes good laws on its people. For children in their formation, this is really vital that they are taught a certain way, because they need to form these habits of living by the natural law. If they're not formed the habits of living by the natural law when they are young, then when they get older, it's going to be very hard to form them. And that is why moral formation of children needs to be at the center of the thoughts of a parent. Oftentimes, the parents think about it, it's neglected to a degree that it shouldn't be. All right, insofar as man is formed in what is truly right and wrong for his nature, this can be determine the psychological health of that individual. So if we don't raise our children to know right and wrong, and they're not making this decision to do what is good and avoid what is evil, they're likely going to have big problems when they get older. A lot of the problem of children in their older age is from the formation of their parents. Now, you can always have children that had great parents and they screwed up. Among the apostles, they were led by Jesus, the greatest seminary instructor ever. Yet, Judas still betrayed Jesus. Our children ultimately have free will, but it is really important that we as parents take a lot of time and energy to properly morally form our children. And this is why it's really important to have them sent to either a good Catholic school if they're available, and if they're not available, to give them good Catholic moral formation so that when, especially in their teenage years, they have the foundation to act well. Okay. The acts of the conscience are of three kinds. The first is that the conscience recognizes whether a current action under consideration should or should not be done. And for this reason, the conscience is said to bind or incite. Conscience will punish those who do not follow the natural law. Okay, as we said before, if you do something you feel guilty about it, then, or you do something bad, you're going to feel guilty about it. Your conscience is going to remember your past. It's going to make you dwell on it. And it's going to want you, to the very minimum, change that act in the future. Our conscience is really helpful. It allows us to perfect ourselves. It gives us a motivation to change our life. So the second act of the conscience is to remember sins of the past. This is where after we've committed the sin, after we've done something, we can reflect on that back sin and we can change it. Though some people can do this in an unhealthy manner and get fixated on a particular vice they've done, and usually this is pride. Some people are sometimes so focused on, well, how could I sin? How could I offend God? It's so terrible I offended in the past. And this usually leads to a sin of scrupulosity. It should be done in a healthy manner where one remembers their past sins and one's obtained humility. They remember, I am a horrible sinner. I look at other people and I'm also a terrible person as well. I have a lot of things that I need to work on. Okay, so the second act was remembering sins of the past. And the third act of the conscience is how well were the actions done. So this can be really in two ways. One can be, let's say you did something sinful, but either you didn't really know that act was sinful, so there's ignorance in the knowledge of the sin, or there was ignorance that you were actually committing the act. Let's say you were driving and you hit someone and somehow your window was foggy and you really couldn't see someone, and it really wasn't your fault. There really was no sin there, right? The way that particular action was committed, the ignorance, could make you feel less guilty for the act. But let's say there was some sort of sin, and you had an obligation to go to Mass on a certain day, and you thought, maybe I don't have an obligation. And you're just like, well, I'm just not going to look it up. Because if I don't look up the days of obligation, then I'm ignorant and I'm free from sin. Well, in that case, you knew you should look it up, and you purposely chose to be ignorant. Because you chose to be ignorant, to avoid your duty, you committed a sin in doing that. We could apply this example to something else to make it more concrete for people. Let's say I think, oh, you know what, my children are going to be eating, my small child might be eating some sort of material. And, I think it could be poisonous. I'm pretty sure I heard it's poisonous, but I'm like, whatever. I don't take the time to examine and look on the label, see, is this harmful if swallowed? And let's say my child gets very sick or even dies from that. Well, in that case, did I commit a sin by being negligent? By, even though I didn't know it was poisonous, I didn't take the time and energy to investigate it and see if that material was harmful to my child. Yes, I create a very grave sin by doing that. So those are the three ways conscience works. And the last thing, conscience can actually allow you to sin with something that is not sinful in and of itself. An example, let's say you believe that tomorrow is a holy day of obligation. You're sure of it. You check the app and you're certain it said tomorrow is a holy day of obligation. But you decide, you know what, I'm busy, I'm kind of tired, and I really want to watch the football game. You know what, I'm just not going to go. I don't care. Then you find out, actually, it wasn't a holy day of obligation. You made a mistake. You find out the day afterwards. But the fact that you thought that God wanted you to go to Mass on that day, it was God's law, and God was commanding you to do so, but you didn't care, you didn't go anyways. You still committed a sin because your conscience was telling you God wanted you to do this. This was a law of God, but you didn't care to follow God's law. All right, that is the end of the talk on natural law.